The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the fourth day of this 7-day session here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico in April 2023. Nakagawa Soen Roshi was the first teacher that Roshi Kapleau encountered in Japan when he went there to actually do training. He had been in Japan before as part of the team of scribes, I think you can call them, that were transcribing the post-World War II war crimes trials. He'd been also a court reporter in Nuremberg when they were doing that in Germany, and he was sent again, and this time I believe he was the head court reporter in Japan. And he had been so struck by the difference in the attitude of the Germans versus the Japanese at the end of the war. The Germans were quite self-defensive, apparently, according to him, and were always saying, well, why me? Why am I getting persecuted for this? Even though it was a prosecution, because they had made possible the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in a massive pogrom against anybody that the Nazis did not feel warranted life on this earth. It was a pretty dreadful situation. By contrast, the Japanese were apologizing for their role in the war. They had been led to believe, apparently by the emperor, that it was a war against Western aggression that was trying to take over the world, when in actuality it was a war of aggression by the Japanese. They had entered Manchuria, they had executed thousands of Chinese, and they had entered Korea the same, and they had used Korean women as, pleasure slaves of Japanese soldiers. And they had attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. And in order to do something to counteract that power, the power between Japan and Germany, the United States went into war. And this was the upshot, that actually when the Japanese people learned the truth about the war, they realized that they had been duped. But that's another story. So when Roshi went to Japan for the war crimes trials there, he spent his off time in the Japanese temple gardens. He'd already had some interest in Japan, and he was so struck by the incredible level of peace in those gardens. And if you go to the gardens today even, you will find that essence there as well. This is from hundreds of years of incredibly attentive, careful caretaking of those gardens, and the zazen that was done for so many hundreds of years as well in those temples that the gardens surrounded. Nowadays, of course, after the Meiji Restoration and the fall of Buddhism in Japan in terms of popularity and government acceptance, most of those temples have fallen out of use. Many have just simply died. When I was living in Japan, you could buy a temple. But nowadays, there are very, very few Japanese Buddhist temples that actually teach and train Buddhists. Sogenji is one of them, but it is quite rare. Up in Obama, once Tangen Roshi died, Bukokuji still is holding sittings, but they're essentially led by the head monk because he left no successors. Hoshinji, which is a stone's throw away, literally, in Obama as well, which is where Roshi Kapleau trained for a number of years under Daiyun Sogaku Harada Roshi, apparently fell apart after Sogaku Roshi died. And this is why at Bukokuji, when I went there for Rohatsu Sesshin, I was stunned by the fact that people just came and went whenever they felt like coming to the sittings. The Japanese were more regular and more committed, but the foreigners that were there for the Rohatsu Sesshin, it kind of blew my mind. There were 17 women that were attending this sesshin, and many of them were foreigners. And I remember particularly a French woman who just didn't show up for sitting after the midday meal. I guess she was taking a nap. In those days, it was a surprise because in Rochester, if you decided to opt out of the afternoon sitting, you would be brought back in by one of the monitors. Here it's the Jisharyo's duty to do that. That said, Roshi Kapleau, who was in his mid-50s, late 50s, I think, when he returned to the United States from training in Japan, he was in his early 40s when he went there, was tired. He was not a person who was physically active, and he took naps every single day for several hours. And then later he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and the naps got longer because that was one of his symptoms of Parkinson's was exhaustion. One time I went into his quarters when I was head monitor there during a sesshin, and he was lying exhausted on the floor. He hadn't even had the energy to get to his bed, and yet he hung in there and kept going, kept teaching, because that was his life by that time, was to teach. So inspired by the energy in those gardens in Japan, when Roshi went back to the United States, he went to Columbia University and took courses under D.T. Suzuki and learned about Buddhism, and eventually decided to cut his ties to the United States because he was afraid that if he didn't, he would flee and go back to Japan to train in Zen. So he sold his business, left behind everything, and went to Japan and encountered Nakagawa Soen Roshi. Soen Roshi was an unusual person. He was, first of all, an English speaker, which was rare in those days in Japan. It's even rare now, even though kids are taught English in grade school. I remember when I went to Japan for the first time, going to Sogenji, and I had already been in Japan quite a few years before that, 1963, on our way to live in Burma, but I had not actually gone to train there until 1992, and I was totally unfamiliar with the language. I managed somehow to get from the airport to the train station and get the last ticket to the last train that would take me to Okayama, where Sogenji was. And I went up to the platform. I got instructions in which platform I should go to, but I got to the platform, and then I was wondering, okay, which train that was going to arrive was the right one for me to get on. So there was a young Japanese couple standing nearby, and I went to the couple and asked the woman. I showed her the ticket and said, is the next train going to be one that will stop at Okayama? She screamed. The man, however, highly amused by that, had a few words of English and was able to tell me, yes, the next train would be to Okayama. So I got in the train and eventually got to Sogenji well after midnight, after the sesshin had begun, that I was there for the first time for. And so at any rate, it was very unusual for Soen Roshi to speak English. Moreover, he was very interested in art and music, the kinds of things that Roshi Kapleau were also interested in. And so they connected. Nakagawa Soen Roshi allowed Roshi Kapleau to stay at Ryutakuji, which is a Rinzai training temple in Japan, and all he needed to do was sit for 1 hour a day. Didn't matter what time, he just needed to sit 1 hour a day, and he could not sit in the zendo. He was not allowed in the zendo. That was that was for monks who were committed to ongoing Zen practice and had proven their commitment. So he did that, and Nakagawa Soen Roshi would take him along with him when he went to visit his artist and musician friends and translate for him. It was quite a lovely introduction to Zen practice, and of course that gave Roshi Kapleau a very skewed idea of what Zen practice was. And then one day, after 3 months went by, and he saw Nakagawa Soen Roshi. Soen Roshi had a letter in his hand, and he looked at it and he said, "I think I will take you to Hoshinji, where you can train under Daiun Sogaku Roshi, and I will go along with you, and I will translate for the sesshin, which happened to be a Rohatsu sesshin, which is jumping in at the end of the pool, the deep end of the pool." And so he did. They went on the train ride and all the way up to actually it's more than a train ride. It's a train ride and then a bus ride to Obama. It still is. And Hoshinji. And there they entered the Rohatsu sesshin. Rohatsu sesshin, especially in Japan, is one of great rigor. First of all, it's incredibly nasty and cold, and there is no heat. It's damp cold, which is worse, and the winds and the snow and the blizzards come across the Sea of Japan from Manchuria. So it's a pretty wretched time to start a sesshin, particularly the first one. And on top of that, Roshi Kapleau had no flexibility. He was a middle-aged businessman. I think he was 43 years old, and he never sat in a kneeling position or a cross-legged position in his whole life. And it was only cross-legged positions back there that were acceptable to sit in the zendo, and there he was in the zendo. It's interesting that earlier than that, Ruth Fuller Sasaki had gone to sesshin and had been allowed to sit in a chair. There's photographs of her sitting in a chair in the zendo with all the monks sitting, of course, in their usual way. But for Roshi Kapleau, there were no chairs. They didn't have any. People didn't sit in chairs back then in Japan. They sat on the floor. So they were naturally stretched out and able to sit cross-legged or seiza, which is a kneeling position. And he struggled. He struggled, but he was persistent. He was determined to do it. And so he did. But the last night, which is a night where they actually start treating people who are obviously super dedicated to an extra night's sitting, helped along by the kyosaku, as they call it in Soto Zen, which is the stick which is applied to the shoulders to help keep people awake, keep people centered, and help them do their zazen. They're normally struck on a couple of acupuncture points on either side of the neck, on the shoulders, on the fleshy part of the shoulders, and it can actually help a great deal. But for many people, it is anathema because they've been around people who have been beaten or they themselves have been beaten. So we don't use it here at Mountain Gate. It's a different form anyway. It's the Rinzai Keisaku, as it's called. It's longer, and you're facing the person as you're striking them. They're bowing down so that you are able to place the stick at the right place on their shoulder and not hopefully miss and hit a bone. So he actually fainted from the pain of it. The pain of 7 days and going through into the 8th morning of sitting cross-legged and having the keisaku or kyosaku. And so he just collapsed. The next morning, Soen Roshi, who was not Roshi back then yet, he was a fellow monk, and somehow he found an egg, and he brought Roshi Kapleau a raw egg, which is typical in Japan. When I was there in 1963, breakfast could often consist of a bowl of rice with a raw egg on top. I didn't meet it when I was there more recently, but that's what it was back then. And it was an amazing gesture for Soen Roshi because it was post-war, immediately post-war, and eggs, anything that had protein in it, any food at all, was exceedingly rare, very hard to come by. They also had somehow managed to find a rickety chair. And so he sat in I think it was in the bathhouse, because there at least it's a little bit warm, because the hot water is in the tub, although the tub is covered. And he survived. Not only did he survive, but he decided to stay. And Soen Roshi left and went back to Ryutakuji. And from then on, Maturation was his teacher. He stayed there for a number of years until it was clear he had some serious problems with nutritional deficiencies. And so Maturation suggested to him that it would be better for him to leave the temple and go into teaching English, where he could make money and buy food and get his health back. And that he would train then with Yasutani Roshi. So he chose to do that. There was a makyo during a sesshin not long before that, where Roshi was in the middle of sesshin, is reaching out and doing something like this. It seemed like he was grabbing something. And when the monks asked him what the heck he was doing, he said he was in a grocery store pulling cans of food off the shelf. Another indication that he was not in good physical shape. He got his health back, and the rest is history. He stayed 10 more years, I believe, in Japan, training with Yasutani Roshi, before Yasutani Roshi gave him permission to return to the United States and set up a teaching temple. So I'd like to share with you something of Nakagawa Soen Roshi's early training. He trained under Genpo Roshi, who is highly respected Rinzai master in Japan. And here is the tale. I'll share it from a book on Nakagawa Soen Roshi's life called Endless Vow. One day, Genpo Roshi asked monk Soen to accompany him to the temple where he had been ordained, Seikeiji, on Shikoku Island. Genpo Roshi went there quite often to express his gratitude to his deceased ordination teacher. On this occasion, the war had just ended, leaving Japan in chaos. And traveling by train was nearly impossible. Overwhelming crowds of people would wait for days for trains, which ran infrequently and unpredictably, unlike how they run now, which is incredibly predictably and incredibly frequently. It's quite wonderful, the transportation system in Japan these days. When a train did arrive, there would be a mad rush, not only for seats, but for standing room or a place to hang on to the doorway. This is very different now. Everything is incredibly orderly. Genpo Roshi and monk Soen found a spot in an aisle. Genpo Roshi sat on the floor, squeezing his body into an uncomfortable small spot. Monk Soen, however, sat in full lotus on the floor. Many people admired him, his zazen concentration. On the way back, there were the same overcrowded trains. And upon returning to Jutakaji, Genpo Roshi called the monk to his room and scolded him in a thundering voice. "What's the matter with you? Zazen is not a performance. Under such circumstances you must think of others and make yourself as small as you can. That is Zazen. Get out of here." Monk Soen, who had been so admired, left Genpo Roshi's room humiliated and angry. He went to a pond at the Mishima shrine. Jutakaji is in Mishima, and the shrine is a Shinto shrine, and jumped in the water. Mulling over his teacher's words, he understood what Genpo Roshi meant. He returned to Jutakaji and apologized. That is an example of working on the long maturation, which is so essential in Zen practice. Soen Roshi was not Roshi back then, but he was full of himself to a certain point. It's not known whether he had had a kensho yet or not, but he was trying to demonstrate what a good monk he was by sitting cross-legged in the midst of a huge crowd of people who were actually, there could have been another person or two on the train if he had simply folded himself into a very small position. And Zen practice is about becoming one with the circumstances. There's another story about a master who takes an attendant monk along with him to dinner at one of his students' houses or one of the supporters' houses. And during the dinner, the monk goes off in a corner and sits zazen. But the Roshi himself sits at the table, drinks sake, had a wonderful time, joking and laughing with his supporters. On the way home, that Roshi also berated the monk. "What do you think you were doing? That was not zazen. You were completely off the map when it came to your training. Zazen is not to take yourself away from a situation, but to be fully engaged in it. And that's something for all of us to remember, that Zazen is not about removing yourself from the moment as it is and going off in a corner and sitting Zazen. If the moment involves something other than sitting Zazen. Of course, when you're in the Zendo or when you have a moment independent of anything else in which to sit Zazen, then you do that. But you don't do that in the midst of a situation where you're actually trying to deal with other stuff as well and not entering into the moment as it is. This is part of the long maturation. Zazen is intended to bring us to a place where we realize our true nature and to fulfill that realization by embodying it, so that one of the aspects of awakening is oneness. It's not by any means the full awakening, but it is one of the things we enter into early in the process of coming to awakening. And it's important to recognize that that's an important aspect of life. We don't remove ourselves from situations, although it's incredibly tempting to when we'd rather do something else, or when the situation is so unpleasant or boring that we'd like to just tune out. Now, this is different from becoming a victim of trauma. A traumatic incident is one in which we need to survive. And to survive, there are many mechanisms, and one of them is to check out emotionally, and just zone out on the situation if you cannot escape it. That is fine. That is, in one way, becoming one with that situation, because there's no other way to do it, particularly for children. If you're too little and the people who are abusing you are bigger, there's no way you can really outrun them. There's no way you can escape other than just tuning out and experiencing whatever abuse they're giving you. And then, of course, when you grow up, to work on coming back to life, because when we have ongoing traumatic experiences, we begin to live in a kind of zombie-like way, because it's just too painful to be present. And that's fine. That's an appropriate way to deal with it under those circumstances. But unfortunately, that kind of tuning out can become a habit pattern, so that when we become adults and are no longer in the traumatic situations or the painful situations, then it hinders our really fully living life. And so we need to work on becoming more present. Zazen will help a great deal with that, but it can also help to do therapy. This is also part of the long maturation. The long maturation is a process in which we gradually live what we increasingly realize through our Zen practice. And it is absolutely fundamental if we are to live fully and completely in this rich and amazing life that we have. In times earlier in Zen practice, that was not emphasized. Although, interestingly enough, Torei Enji, who was Hakuin's Dharma successor at age 28, I believe, very young age, he had been practicing for a long time and with incredible dedication. And he almost died. It is assumed it might have been TB. It's not really known. And when he was simply sleeping as much as he could to heal, and when he was awake, he would write down all he understood about Zen practice. And of course, he survived and eventually took over Ryutakuji, by the way. But he wrote what is called a treatise of the inexhaustible lamp of Zen, which is a wonderful book, and you can get it from one of the original translators, who was the teacher at, she's deceased since, at Zen Center of London. You can find it on their site. Contact them and get a copy. And that is the ideal copy to get, because it also has translations of a concurrent 20th century Zen master, Daibi, who kind of expresses some of the missing parts of the history that would make the whole thing make more sense. And in that, he talks about the long maturation. But somehow it seems to have gotten lost over the centuries. It's gradually, slowly coming back now, because in the intervening years, particularly in the United States, there have been abuses by senior teachers, Zen teachers who supposedly had deep awakening experiences, but had not done that long maturation. And so their issues, they still had hidden away somewhere underground and refusing to acknowledge and refusing to deal with. And so they were still caught in those ways. So the long maturation is absolutely vital. And the incident you heard a few minutes ago about Nakagawa Soen Roshi in his early years of training expressed that. He did not behave in the most appropriate way and the most thoughtful, considerate way. Instead, he tried to prove he was such a wonderful Zen monk. And he got it. After the dressing down by Genpo Roshi and a plunge into a pond, I don't know what time of year it was, but it could have been kind of icy, and had time to think it over. Then he went back and apologized. And Soen Roshi was an incredible teacher. He unfortunately died. He was well known for being eccentric, and he liked to go into the forest on walks. And apparently he had climbed a bamboo, which is not really, even the big bamboos are not really steady enough to hold somebody for very long, and fell and somehow landed. His head was pierced with a stalk of bamboo, and after that he was no longer sort of as normal as he had been, which was not super normal, but still he eventually, a few months later, died. But it is something to recognize that our practice is not complete unless we are also concurrently working on the long maturation, so that we bring our behavior, our thought, our speech into line with what we are increasingly realizing. In that way, our Zen practice truly comes to fruition. So we'll stop now and recite the 4 vows. Thank you for listening.